The inflation rate in Great Britain has risen to its highest level in almost 10 years. In October, the prices were on average 4.2% higher than 12 months earlier, the National Statistics Agency announced on Wednesday. In the previous month, the price increase was 3.1%. The rise in monetary devaluation was stronger than expected and higher than it has been since November 2011. According to the information, gas and electricity turned out to be price drivers, which were on average 12% more expensive. And the reason for this was, of course, the regulatory authorities have raised the maximum price set for end consumers in order to take wholesale prices into account. Used cars, fuel, visits to restaurants and hotels have also become significantly more expensive. Costs for industrial products and raw material prices have also increased significantly, said the authority. The Statistical Office named the consequences of the corona pandemic as another reason for the high inflation. The restrictions a year ago would have caused some prices to drop dramatically at the time. These are now the basis for calculating the current inflation rate, which distorts the figures in the short term. In practice, inflation occurs when consumer prices rise. A distinction is made between supply and demand inflation. So let's talk first about supply inflation. Companies can force inflation by raising their prices, for example, to increase their profit or to pass on increased costs, for example, for energy or wages, to the consumers. And as I said, there's demand inflation. It's also possible that consumers want to buy so many products and services that there is not enough on offer. In this case, demand drives inflation as manufacturers and suppliers can charge more money for their scarce goods. In this case, wages often rise along with prices so that a self-reinforcing wage price spiral is set in motion. That can fuel inflation even further. Put simply, money loses value when inflation occurs as the price level rises within the economy. Accordingly, an average of many prices must first increase for the term to actually apply. So-called unit price increases for coffee, for example, are excluded from this. So if the coffee in the supermarket costs more in the short term, nobody is talking about inflation. Because by definition, inflation is always an ongoing process. In summary, inflation is defined by both general and constant price increases. This inevitably means that people can afford less for their money, or to put it another way, the purchasing power of money is decreasing. While inflation describes the general and sustained rise in prices within an economy, deflation describes the exact opposite. The price level is falling. The value of money increases. In the case of deflation, the inflation rate is then negative. Both inflation and deflation can have a negative impact on a country's economy, even if they have different causes. But what are the causes of inflation? Several causes can devalue money. Basically, three factors influence inflation. There's first the lack of offer, as I said. If a raw material is only available in small quantities, the price usually rises. This form of inflation can sometimes be imported due to a high level of dependence on other countries and their raw materials. For example, here in Germany, we are dependent on the oil of other countries. If trade relationships are inhibited or delivery bottlenecks occur, the whole thing also affects us in terms of price. At the same time, monopolists can use their market power to drive prices up. Conversely, consumers postpone costly investments as they hope for lower prices again. And then, as I also mentioned before, there's increased demand. Prices rise when certain goods are in greater demand and the suppliers cannot meet the demand despite full production. This is, as I mentioned, a demand inflation. Corresponding trends are particularly evident in times of economic boom. And there's an increase of money supply as a possible reason. If a central bank increases the money supply within an economy, for example to promote liquidity, inflationary prices can arise. If the amount of money exceeds the amount of goods disproportionately, the price level increases accordingly. A comparable scenario emerged in Germany after the First World War, for example. But what are the consequences and effects of inflation? The money supply and the prices for goods of all kinds should be as stable as possible, because a sustained rise in the price level has consequences. There is less demand, which for reasons of cost forces companies to further increase their prices. And there's the real interest rate trap. Increased inflation in combination with a low interest rate policy of a central bank results in a negative real interest rate for some types of investment. For example, the money in the current account loses value then. But how is the inflation rate calculated? A representative fictitious shopping basket is used to calculate the inflation rate. This contains all goods that private households consume over the course of a year, including groceries, rent, or leisure expenses. As a rule, this basket of goods is rebalanced every 5 years. And the following applies here. Products for which a household generally spends more money are given greater weight. Electricity weighs heavier than salt in a basket. Since not all people have the same purchasing habits, the weight of the goods is based on the average spending habits of all households. This in turn results in a national consumer price index whose change compared to the same month of the previous year reflects the inflation rate. For 2021, economists are forecasting an inflation rate, for example in Germany, of 0.9%. In 2022 it should be 1.3%. In addition, other forms of inflation rates can be calculated. For example, the concept of core inflation is based on what is known as a core inflation rate. This hides product groups whose prices are particularly unstable. The result is an adjusted inflation rate. In the European Union, on the other hand, the harmonized index of consumer prices serves as a uniform calculation basis for comparing price changes internationally and for calculating an overall inflation rate for Europe. The European Central Bank uses the harmonized index of consumer prices to assess price stability within the EU. According to the ECB, price stability is achieved if the annual inflation rate is below 2% in the medium to long term. But now, does Corona cause inflation? The VAT cut in the wake of the Corona pandemic, for example, initially depressed prices here in Germany in 2020. In addition, the energy costs fell. Both these resulted in a low inflation rate of 0.5% last year. The Corona crisis initially had a deflationary effect. Since a strong economic upswing is expected after the pandemic, some economists assume that prices will rise significantly in the medium to long term. At the same time, the huge Corona rescue packages and the scarcity of certain goods are factors that drive prices that increase inflationary pressure. In the short term, however, these effects should fizzle out. For the year 2022, the majority of forecast inflation rates here in Germany, for example, will be below 2%. Long-term effects of the Corona pandemic on the inflation rate can only be roughly estimated at this point in time. This is partly due to the comparatively short experience with the pandemic and its economic consequences. Here, the next few weeks and months will show how the rise in the debt ratio, financing by the central banks, and the production of the money supply develop. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.